So the theme, not just for today, but really through all of Lent, is back to basics. Back to basics. And when I was learning to play that instrument, when I began taking piano lessons at, I think I was about 6 or 7 years old, I quickly learned to hate that saying, back to basics, because it meant when my piano teacher said it, that no matter what fun music I might be working on, it was going to be a day of focusing on posture, hand position, and scales. Oh, I hated that phrase, back to basics. And then when I was a little bit older, I started playing soccer. I know, I have the physique of a soccer player, right? I did it one time. I played soccer for 8 years. Back to basics. When the coach said that, oh my gosh, that meant wind sprints, ball handling, very basic kind of stuff. I hated the fundamentals. But if you watch basketball, especially in the last few days, on Tuesday night, you saw Illinois mop the floor with Michigan by using fundamentals, basics. They didn't just outshoot Michigan, they out-rebounded Michigan. Their ball handling was spectacular. Their passing game was way above where it normally is. The fundamentals that's how Illinois won. And then yesterday, Ohio State learned the same thing. And I could just talk about Illinois basketball for a while, but Cheryl, I see you there, and I understand that this has been a hard year for Duke, and I see the Jones family in Kentucky, so we're in mixed company, so let's not gloat too much about how remarkable of a season Illinois is having, even though, by the way, Illinois is having a remarkable season. Back to basics. But you know, it's not just in music or athletics. In our spiritual discipline, sometimes it's good to go back to those basic foundational practices too. Basic foundational practices like prayer and fasting, almsgiving, basic things like worshiping and praising God daily, not just on Sundays. These are the things that our entire religion is built on. This is what our faith is built on. And just like with a house or any other building, if the foundation is not strong, whatever we build on top of it is not going to be very strong either. So in that light, today we are going back to basics in our faith, because this is what we do during Lent. And this is our back to basics time before we celebrate the resurrection at Easter. And our reading from Exodus today gets us started on one of the most basic lists that, as Homer and Malachi were talking about, probably a lot of us learned as children in Sunday school. Our reading from Exodus stopped after only the first couple commandments, but I'm going to go talk about all 10 of them today. If you want to reference them, you know where they are. They're in the 20th chapter of Exodus, and you can just keep reading after where Thon left off. But our list begins with one we've probably all heard before. We hear it repeated in the New Testament, and Jesus tells us it is the most important commandment of all, the greatest commandment. In Matthew's Gospel, we hear Jesus say it as, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, and all your strength, sometimes all your soul, depending on the translation. In other words, love the Lord your God with everything you've got. Jesus says that is the greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God with everything you've got. And that doesn't mean that we merely acknowledge the Lord's existence. That doesn't mean that we worship God only on Sunday mornings or when it's convenient. It means that everything we do, everything we are, we recognize that it is that way because of God. In the New Testament, we read, God in whom we live and move and have our being. We cannot exist apart from God. That God knows us, God loves us, God calls us to follow him, God warns us sometimes, God cheers alongside of us, God counsels us, God pleads with us to come closer, to follow, to trust. God forgives us. God is a being who is never absent from us, who continually sustains our lives and gives our lives meaning, and he upholds us, and he gives us gifts to use to benefit other people and to praise his own holy name. And this is the God that we are to bow down before and worship, not because God demands it from us, but because we ought to love God enough and realize what God has given us, that we should really have no other desire than to bow down before God. I think if we were to ask the Hebrew people who first received these commandments, they would say it like this. everything we are, everything we have is from God. Therefore, everything we are and everything we have ought to be used in praise of God. Bow down before God, because the love of God is what sustains our very lives. The second commandment, that's the one about idols, that's the one that Malachi and Homer talked about, gives us some insight of things to avoid. When it comes to bowing down before God, we have to remember that God is a jealous God. God doesn't like it when we divert our time or attention elsewhere. So God says, don't let anything else come before me. Sometimes that's an idol. Some of our Old Testament religious ancestors struggled with that. I think sometimes today we still do. We allow things to come between us and God. But anytime we forget that God is God, that's a violation of this second commandment. You see, we break this commandment by simply forgetting that God is God. We break this commandment by allowing ourselves to think too casually of God. When we allow our minds to imagine God in human form, with human characteristics, somebody that can be my buddy or my friend, we've taken the reverence, the holiness out of God. The second commandment is our reminder that we can't visualize God, we can't draw God, we can't sculpt God. Our minds are not capable of understanding the fullness that is God. Therefore, to do so would break the second commandment. The second commandment is about having reverence for God and remembering that God is far beyond anything we could imagine for ourselves. The third commandment, we didn't cover this in our reading, but like I said, I'm going to go on. The third commandment, that's the one about taking the Lord's name in vain, which when I was a kid meant don't say bad words. But there's more to it than that. This commandment forbids perjury or false testimony. It also forbids unnecessary oaths. You should never have to swear by God's name that something is true. Just be an honest person of integrity. Jesus says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. We don't have to swear something on God's name. It's not our name to swear on. And likewise, we should always hold in deep reverence God's church, the scriptures, everything that serves God. Those are not ours to take an oath on. So the commandment here, the teaching is that God's house, his temple, his book, his laws, his prophets, his ministers, everything that serves God should be approached with the reverence, because that's what God calls us to do when we remember that God's name itself is holy, and everything that God has created is holy. The fourth commandment, boy, that's one we break a lot. Honor the Sabbath. That's the one about Sabbath. So we come to now things that are not necessarily part of our faith, but part of our daily living. We have teachings galore about what to do in our religion, but now we get to the first commandment that deals with stuff outside our religion, things like work and how we spend our leisure time and our labor, and these things are addressed here in this commandment. We are to dedicate one day each week, 1 out of 7, to simply resting and being in God's presence. Now, how hard should that be, right? How hard should it be? We are an active people, right? We have jobs and families and commitments. We have active children or grandchildren who require a lot of our time and attention and are involved in numerous extracurricular activities. So, does this commandment mean we have to stop all of that for one day a week and just simply sit and stare at a wall? Not necessarily, no. What it does mean, though, is that one day a week, typically observed on Sunday in our religion, one day a week, we have to avoid all of the stress and the worry and the anxiety that our normal daily or weekly activities would place upon us. One day a week, our time and attention is not focused on what I need to get done, but simply giving God the praise he's due. One day a week, we have to recharge our spiritual batteries by stopping ourselves working so hard. We have to stop the machine so that we can plug it into the charger. That's the image here. One day a week to rest, allowing God to restore us and to refill us. We enjoy this one day a week with family or friends, and we can still do things to be productive on this one day a week, but productivity is not the goal. The goal is to focus on being in God's company. Doing these things will remind us that God is always with us. And the really neat thing about this particular commandment is It's not just a suggestion for stress-free living. This is a biblical commandment. God says you must take one day a week and set aside all of the stuff that normally keeps you busy and distracts you. One day a week, give to God. The fifth commandment, that's the one about honoring our parents. Now, first let me say, as a matter of practicality, as a matter of truth, that nobody's parents are perfect, except for my children's. No, nobody's parents are perfect, and Ella and Ben and Evan, you know that. You will know that more as you age. Nobody's parents are perfect. We make mistakes. Each one of us, our parents, have earned merits and demerits. They've tried, they have failed, they have succeeded. Parenting is tough. Amen?
Amen.
If you've been on both sides of it, you know it's tough. Setting all that aside, though, there are some truths here that we can agree on. For their age and their experience, we honor our parents. Because no matter how good or bad they could have been or were, no matter what they should have done differently or didn't, our parents know that just like us, life is difficult sometimes. And if anything, they know it more because they lived a lot longer ago or a lot longer than us. The benefits that they have conferred upon us. Our personalities are in some part biological, so some piece of who you are today, the good and the bad, comes from your parents. Let's focus on the good and thank them for that. And we honor them for their love, even if they didn't or don't show it the way we'd like them to. As a rule, I believe parents, generally speaking, love their children more than their children could ever possibly understand. I think that's just kind of how it works. Sometimes parents don't always show that. I think parents generally make sacrifices for their children that their children will probably never ever realize or appreciate or reciprocate. And if we have parents, all of us, or had parents living at one time, that means we were the beneficiary of that at some point in our lives. And for that, we can honor our parents. Even if we saw it or didn't see it, the love they had for us. The sixth commandment, that's the one about murder. Now, to that one, most of us would probably say, well, yeah, that's no problem. I don't intend on killing anybody this week. I think I can check that off my list as pass, right? But not only are murder and violence prohibited in this commandment, angry thoughts are sins. That's where murder begins. It begins in the heart. Murder doesn't begin with a weapon. It's not a sin of the hands. Murder begins as hurt or fear, and it festers into anger, and that anger festers and grows into violent thoughts, and those violent thoughts can fester and grow into physical altercations. All of that begins right here in the heart. So this commandment tells us that not only violence to the body, but injury to the soul is of concern. Anger and bitterness, that's how we violate that commandment. The seventh commandment, the one about adultery. So here we have some commentary, and if you look in Exodus 20, you'll see that there's some additional commentary with this one, explaining the detail of this commandment and what it ought to mean to us. Not only adultery, but impurity of any kind. In fact, what we think, what we feel, what's going on in our minds and in our hearts. If these thoughts, if these feelings are impure or dishonorable, that's the sin. That's how we violate this commandment. Simply thinking about someone as a means of physical gratification, that's adultery. That's a sin. And so all in all, this commandment speaks to our need to be pure and right, not only in our actions, but also in our thoughts and in our hearts. And just like the one about murder before it, this commandment can be broken without any act ever actually taking place. It all begins in the heart. The eighth commandment, that's the one about stealing. I tend to be maybe a little naive because I like to think that most people don't go around stealing. I like to think that most people are more honest than that, and we know that we shouldn't take things that don't belong to us. That's direct stealing. But indirect stealing is maybe a little more challenging. Maybe that's something more of a problem. Concealment of deficits, misrepresenting quality, using false weights or measures, any form of deception during any kind of transaction, that counts as stealing, you know. It's not just a pickpocketing or shoplifting sin here. as a matter of biblical commandments, as a matter of theology, anything up to and including being dishonest on your taxes counts as stealing, or failing to mention that the air conditioner doesn't always work on that used car that you're selling. That counts as stealing, you know. It's considered stealing if you have more resources than you need and you refuse to share them with those who need. According to the New Testament, that's considered stealing too. Lord help us, yeah? The 9th commandment, the one about false witness, bearing false witness, now that generally makes me think of courtroom dramas like Law and Order. I used to love watching that show. When Julie and I were first married, that was our binge show before binge watching was a thing. Is this cutting in and out? A little bit. We're going to switch to red. Law and Order. Jack McCoy, New York prosecutor. Did you ever watch Law and Order? I was a Lenny Briscoe fan. I love that detective. Snarky, sarcastic, jaded. That's my kind of cop, right? Law and Order, that's what I thought of when I think of false witness or perjury, because how many times did I see McCoy grilling a witness on the stand, threatening perjury if they weren't 100% honest? The reality is, most of us will probably live our whole lives having never experienced what it's like to sit on a courtroom witness stand, because that's not something that happens to most people. But there are other ways that we can give false witness or false testimony. Think about this for a minute. If you overhear someone talking about how wonderfully kind their neighbor was, you may or may not pay attention to that. But if you overhear someone talking about what a jerk their neighbor was, boy, your ears are going to perk right up for that. It's something about how we're wired. We love hearing stories about the sinners, not the saints necessarily. There's something about that destruction of character that intrigues us. When somebody has something bad to say about someone else, we like to hear what it's all about. And this is a form of false witnessing, because we see this all too often. When we get mad at someone, instead of just confronting them and dealing with it one-to-one, it's become a very natural thing to assault their character and to do it publicly. Instead of sharing a beef I have with someone directly to them, I'll go to everyone else I know and tell them what a lousy so-and-so that guy is, right? That's false witness. When we berate people, when we downgrade who they are as a human because of what they've done, we are bearing false witness against them. And the 10th commandment, that's the one about coveting. Now, on the surface, this commandment seems like a precursor to one of the others, maybe adultery or stealing. After all, coveting generally leads to those things. But there's a different reason, I think, that this commandment finishes out our list and remains its own commandment. Coveting is the only of the 10 commandments that can be broken only in our hearts. Coveting is the only of the commandments that we can't do an action to. It's only in our hearts. Because this commandment reminds us, if we haven't picked up on it already, that the thoughts of our hearts, what goes on in our minds, that's all covered by God's law too. It's not just how we conduct ourselves, but it's actually what we think and what we feel that are covered by God's law. The private thoughts of our hearts, God is very much concerned about those things. So it's important to remember that God not only sees what we do, but God sees those private innermost thoughts. And since covetousness and greed are the root causes of so much evil in the world, so much evil, God addresses this one specifically. Now, does it mean that we can't have nice things? No, of course not. Does it mean that we can't aspire for some earthly comfort? No, of course not. But to be covetous, to be coveting, means to be completely dissatisfied with what God has provided. To always wish we had what our neighbor had. To always wish we had something more than what God has blessed us with. To covet is the opposite of being content. All of these rules, these basic rules for faithful living together, when we take the time to go back to basics, to review this list, and then to look honestly at ourselves, perhaps then the prayer of today's psalm rings out especially true. Our psalmist today says, "Cleanse me from my hidden faults, O Lord, and let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, my Lord, my rock, and my Redeemer. Amen.